Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on everyday life of the Jeffersonian Republic. The core question is this: how did rural households, women's education, revival religion, and expansion define daily life in the Jeffersonian Republic? The core competency is to describe rural life, the lives of women, and the nature of American political and religious life during the Jeffersonian era. Can a republic built on independent households expand fast enough to preserve that independence, or does expansion change the ideal itself? The Jeffersonian era spoke constantly about independence, virtue, and Republican citizenship, but those words rested on a material foundation. A citizen who owned land, managed a household, and appeared free from dependence on wages or aristocratic patrons fit the ideal image of the age. Thomas Jefferson described the yeoman farmer as the safest guardian of Republican liberty because farming linked property, labor, and civic stake. That argument did not float above daily life. It shaped expectations about who counted politically, how territory should be organized, and what kind of economy the republic ought to favor. The ideal sounded simple, but it required an expanding land system, functioning local markets, road improvement, federal surveys, and legal title. The peaceful transfer of power in the election of 1800 gave the Jeffersonian program its opening. Jefferson's victory over John Adams followed a bitter campaign and a tie with Aaron Burr that sent the election to the House of Representatives. After multiple ballots, Jefferson prevailed. His first inaugural address in March 1801 tried to calm the nation by declaring, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." The statement changed events because party conflict had become fierce, yet it also masked a sharper social program. Jeffersonian politics preferred a republic of landholders over a republic dominated by banks, merchants, and central fiscal machinery. The question for everyday life was whether ordinary households could actually inhabit that vision. Rural life in the early republic depended on property systems, not only on plows and weather. The land ordinance survey pattern already in place from the Confederation era divided Western land into measured townships and sections. Federal land offices processed claims and sales. Surveys made acreage legible. Patents converted surveyed parcels into recognized ownership. Counties recorded deeds and boundaries. Roads and river transport linked farms to mills, towns, and export routes. A farm household could imagine independence because clerks, surveyors, sheriffs, and courts made ownership enforceable. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 widened that framework dramatically. Napoleon Bonaparte's government, needing money and facing difficulties in Saint-Domingue after the Haitian Revolution, sold the vast Louisiana territory to the United States. Jefferson accepted the purchase even though the Constitution did not clearly spell out an acquisition power of that size. The deal doubled the nation's claimed territory and secured control of the Mississippi River outlet through New Orleans, a critical artery for Western farmers sending produce downstream. Barges loaded with flour, pork, whiskey, and other goods depended on that route. The purchase therefore affected ordinary rural life, as well as high politics. Western households needed market access, and the Mississippi shaped their economic horizon more than abstract maps. Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery, sent out in 1804, further tied federal authority to agrarian expansion. The expedition gathered geographic information, cataloged plants and animals, met native nations, and identified routes and resources. Its journals later fed settler knowledge about the West. The expedition did not create Western desire, but it made federal exploration part of national planning. Expansion looked less like rumor and more like state-backed possibility. Patent law belongs in the same world. Congress's patent legislation rewarded inventors with temporary rights to useful discoveries, encouraging practical improvement. Farm tools, processing devices, and mechanical experiments fit an economy that was not yet dominated by large factories, but still valued innovation. The Republic celebrated the small landholder while also protecting technical ingenuity. Daily life in the Jeffersonian era therefore combined household labor, local exchange, and growing legal structures for improvement. Market exchange linked that local world to larger systems. Farmers in the Ohio Valley floated produce downriver toward New Orleans. Mid-Atlantic grain growers supplied flour for urban and export markets. Southern planters sold tobacco and later cotton through merchant houses that advanced credit and arranged shipment. Local stores extended credit for salt, cloth, ironware, and tools. Debts were entered in account books and settled after harvest when possible. A poor road season or a low price in a distant market could unsettle a household that still described itself as independent. The ideal farm household was a work unit before it was a symbol. Men cleared fields, repaired fences, bargained over crops, hauled goods to market, and answered militia calls when necessary. Women cooked, preserved food, spun, sewed, supervised children, kept household stores, and often managed accounts or production rhythms that kept the home functioning. Enslaved laborers carried much of this burden in plantation districts, while free farm families handled it themselves in many northern and western settings. The word independence therefore hid a great deal of unequal labor. A household could appear self-sufficient while depending on wives, daughters, servants, hired hands, or enslaved workers. Women's place in the Jeffersonian Republic reflected that contradiction. Republican motherhood gave women civic importance by assigning them the task of raising virtuous sons and maintaining moral households. The language of the era praised women's influence while restricting formal political power. Education for women expanded in some regions because literate mothers supposedly served the republic better. Female academies multiplied modestly. Yet the justification often remained instrumental. Women deserved education because households and sons required it, not because equal citizenship had been recognized. Judith Sargent Murray pushed harder. In essays such as On the Equality of the Sexes, first published in the 1790s, she argued that apparent female inferiority came from denied educational opportunity rather than natural incapacity. Her intervention is decisive because it shows intellectual pressure inside a political culture that praised reason while limiting who could publicly exercise it. Murray did not overturn the order, but she documented its inconsistency. Religion also changed everyday life. The Second Great Awakening spread through camp meetings, circuit riders, revival sermons, and voluntary religious association during the early 19th century. Frontier Kentucky meetings at Cane Ridge in 1801 became famous for large crowds, emotional preaching, and conversions. Methodist and Baptist ministers often advanced more effectively than older established churches because they could travel, preach in simple settings, and organize believers in dispersed communities. Revivals linked religion to self-discipline, reform, and communal identity. They also opened some space for women's participation as exhorters, organizers, and moral authorities within religious networks, even while formal leadership structures remained limited. Deism remained present among some educated Americans who preferred a rational creator and moral order without heavy reliance on revealed doctrine or emotional revival. That contrast between revival religion and elite rationalism shaped political and cultural life alike. Rural America was not one thing. It included camp meetings, courthouse elections, local taverns, church discipline, debt disputes, market days, and family labor under pressure from weather and distance. Political life in the countryside also ran through those same institutions. County courthouses hosted elections, deed recording, lawsuits, tax assessment, militia musters, and public notices. Newspapers moved through post roads and subscription networks. Party organizers used printers, dinners, and correspondence to frame the election of 1800 and later campaigns. Ordinary white men encountered the Republic through juries, road labor requirements, church discipline, tax lists, and militia obligation as much as through ballots. Jefferson's first inaugural address works as the central source because it presents national harmony at the very moment his political vision begins to govern. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. Frames the election of 1800 as proof that Republican institutions can survive partisan struggle. The phrase carries real weight. Peaceful transfer of power after a fierce contest was a substantial achievement in an age still haunted by coup, monarchy, and civil collapse. Jefferson's phrasing also conceals tension. Jefferson speaks of equal and exact justice to all men, while presiding over a republic that ties citizenship tightly to white male landholding and tolerates slavery across large parts of the nation. His politics celebrate limited government, yet the Louisiana Purchase stretches federal authority through treaty, money, and territorial claim. He praises rural virtue, yet that virtue depends on surveys, land offices, road work, customs collection on trade, and legal processes that distribute and protect property. The inaugural therefore serves as a public calming document and a political screen. It tells Americans that party conflict need not destroy union, but it does not remove the unequal structure beneath the appeal. The address is especially revealing when read beside Western expansion. The Republic can promise internal peace to its white citizens while enlarging pressure on native nations beyond the Appalachians. It can praise household virtue while narrowing women's public authority. It can celebrate labor while many plantation districts rely on slavery. The address is decisive because its soothing tone sits directly beside those contradictions. The consequence of Jeffersonian politics was expansion of opportunity for some Americans and intensified exclusion for others. White male political participation broadened in many places as property qualifications loosened across the early 19th century, though not uniformly. Western farmers gained stronger access to land and river roads. New settlements grew around surveyed claims and county institutions. Religious participation widened through revival networks. Women's education advanced in limited but important ways. Patent culture and practical improvement encouraged innovation in tools and household production. That uneven expansion can also be measured in infrastructure. Turnpikes, ferries, bridges, and improved river landings became more important as markets widened. Stage routes carried passengers, newspapers, and mail. Post offices connected remote communities to state and national news. These developments did not erase localism, but they changed rural expectation. Families living on farms still thought in household terms while increasingly depending on broader transport and communication systems. Election rituals reflected the same change. Men traveled to polling places, heard candidate names through newspapers or tavern talk, and linked county concerns to state and national offices more regularly than before. Political parties did not erase local life, but they gave scattered voters a shared vocabulary and more regular contact with national contests. Schooling widened unevenly as well. Some communities funded academies or subscription schools, while others relied on household instruction or short local terms. Reading, arithmetic, bookkeeping, and scripture all shaped outcomes in a world of farm accounts, election notices, and church life. Literacy did not create equality, but it deepened the practical reach of public life into rural households. Seasonal rhythms also governed rural existence. Planting, harvest, hog killing, spinning, and food preservation ordered the year. Weather could destroy crops or delay travel. Distance from a mill or market could consume days of labor. Republican language sounded elevated, but most households lived inside a demanding calendar of physical work. Household calendars also shaped politics. Election days, court days, muster days, and church meetings had to fit around planting and harvest. Public life entered the farm year as another set of obligations rather than as a separate civic stage. At the same time, the era's celebrated independence depended on boundaries. Native nations faced increasing pressure from surveyors, settlers, treaties, and military threat. Enslaved people did not share the political freedom associated with agrarian virtue and often made expansion more profitable for elite landholders. Women remained central to household and moral life without equal political standing. The market itself grew more important, which meant that the supposedly self-sufficient farmer still needed roads, buyers, prices, and credit. Jeffersonian democracy therefore broadened freedom selectively, while presenting its own social model as universal. The unresolved judgment follows from that record. Did the Jeffersonian era create a sturdier republic by rooting politics in independent households, or did it define citizenship so narrowly that the language of freedom became inseparable from land, hunger, exclusion, and hidden dependence? The answer lies in the mixed texture of ordinary life. Farm labor, revival religion, women's education, patent paperwork, Western surveys, and river commerce all made the era practical. The same institutions also show that the age of the yeoman was never as simple as its defenders claimed. The agrarian ideal promised civic independence while depending on surveys, markets, westward claims, and unequal labor beneath the surface. The harder judgment is whether that republic strengthened freedom or widened it only for those already positioned to hold land and power. Expansion kept testing the ideal it claimed to serve.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.